What's going on, guys? This is Jake at That Fit Friend, and today I'm joined with my friend Alec Blenis. Alec, thank you for being here, but we want to know how we get to that heavy single leg deadlift. So I believe you're going to take us through the movement and show us how.
Yeah, absolutely. So single leg deadlift, you usually see people doing that with like a kettlebell or something like that. And it's my belief that a lot of people don't really utilize this movement to its full potential. They stay with the super light weights, they're always focusing on their balance and that kind of thing. But the single leg deadlift has really good potential as this really heavy main compound movement to incorporate in your program too. You just have to understand, how do you load it heavily enough? How do you support yourself, support your balance, that kind of thing, to really get a lot out of it.
So step one for the single leg deadlift, should I line up with my foot centered with the barbell and assume like a normal deadlift grip width? Like, can you bring us through like a couple of steps for performing that single leg deadlift?
Yeah, for sure. So a lot of times people struggle to kind of find the center of the bar, if you will, and know where to place their feet. So I often like to tackle it from the top down. So rather than try to find the perfect position and grip at the bottom of the rep, I just like to pick the bar up, just like I'm doing a regular deadlift, kind of get set, get into position, and then I can kind of find my balance and set point at the top. From here, it's gonna feel much more natural. I'm gonna naturally find a really good and stable bottom position. Just gonna go to the bottom there, and then come back up. Whereas what you'll often find is if people just kind of walk up to the bar and just kind of guesstimate like where they want to be, they end up like getting out of position and struggling to really get that bar off the floor. So I like a top-down approach.
Interesting. I really like that. So I'm gonna go ahead and pull a normal deadlift here. So at the top, I'm gonna adjust to feel what feels balanced, and then go ahead and set that bar down. So then from the bottom, I'm assuming this would be our starting position, correct?
Exactly, that's it.
And back foot's gonna be floating?
Back foot's floating, you got it, and then just like a regular deadlift, just pulling straight up. Finding that balance point is super, super helpful. You want the movement to feel as stable as possible, so you're focused on creating tension, lifting weight, and not trying to find your balance and balance point mid-rep.
Got it. So we've established our stance, we found our balance point. Question for you. When we're talking about sequencing the hips, the torso, compared to a normal deadlift, are we gonna assume similar mechanics via the hips and torso with how we're hinging and how we're bending that knee a little bit to get a little bit more quad? Like, is there gonna be any different sequencing that you notice with this exercise?
Yeah, for sure. So just like a regular deadlift, a lot of the same kind of micro variations and form cues apply. So do you want more knee bend or less knee bend? Do you want to focus on really getting the hips back or allow that spine to flex a little bit more intentionally? All those sorts of things you can do with the single leg deadlift, just like you can the regular deadlift. One of the main differences when you're on one leg is you open up some more degrees of freedom for your hips. So instead of just being able to move kind of forward and back in that sagittal plane, we also have the ability to kind of move the hips in this direction, to twist in this direction. So thinking about what are the hips doing in those planes of motion, I think is what makes the single leg deadlift a little more unique.
And then final question regarding the form of the single leg deadlift is, let's say I'm doing a set with like 4 to 6 reps. As I set that bar down, is it okay if I put my foot down to stabilize for a second before I pull it back up? Do people have to perform these continuous? Like,
absolutely.
Take us through the flow to make sure like we're not like internally beating ourselves up because we feel like we're not doing the movement perfect to a T.
So the most important thing, I think people rush into the full freestanding single leg deadlift a little bit too soon, before they have kind of their hip position dialed in, before they have their balance and coordination dialed in. So using some external support and what I call constraints or references to keep your technique solid is far more important than trying to stick to just standing on one leg, for example. So if we think about the motion of the hips, very common mistake or flaw with the single leg deadlift is as people drop into that rep, they kind of rotate out to the side. And the reason that people do that is they're trying to not load that glute. Loading your glute is hard work, but the glute has 3 main functions, and that's gonna be hip extension, which is that forward and back motion. It's gonna be hip abduction, which is the opening of the hip, and then it's gonna be hip external rotation, which is opening up this way. So as we lift the weight, we really wanna see some of all 3 of those things. So when we come off the ground, we wanna see that hip extension, we wanna see a little abduction and external rotation, which means as we drop into the rep, we wanna see the opposite. We wanna see hip flexion, hip adduction, and internal rotation. So if you try to bypass any of those 3 things, you're gonna be getting less load on the glute. So that means as you go down, you don't want to open up, you don't want to spin out, you want to stay nice and tight, internally rotate, adduct the hip. That's going to get you the most load on your glute.
Interesting. Gotcha. And so speaking of constraints, I know we're going to talk about some progressions and also a couple of regressions, but before we do that, let's quickly talk on a couple of mistakes to keep an eye out when performing this. Now, I know we grazed over some in this section already, but maybe we could just talk about like 2 or 3 mistakes that people want to basically avoid when implementing more single leg deadlift work into their program.
Yeah, so biggest mistake to avoid is that major spin out. So a lot of times it's a very functional movement, don't get me wrong. You know, if you're at home and you got to pick up a sock off the ground, you're going to spin the hips out, but it's not a very good position for lifting a lot of weight. So if I try to lift the barbell here and my hips are rotated way out like this, I'm just not in a strong or stable position. It's going to be a ton of strain just on that one QL, and I'm just not going to be very stable in that position. So you want to make sure you keep those hips square to the floor. And if you need to keep your back foot down for a little reference, you can absolutely do that.
And so square and then a little opening is normal and fine. It's that grandiose, like kind of like that barbell's taking us on a journey.
Exactly, and I'd rather see someone open up on the ascent of the lift than on the descent of the lift.
Gotcha.
So if you get into a nice closed position down here, and when you start to lift that weight, you open up a little bit as you come up, you're gonna feel a ton of glutes. That's awesome. But if you start to open up on the way down, you're kind of working around that glute and you're not gonna feel it as much.
Got it. And then a question, and I actually want to see if this is even a mistake, is with foot position and when you're setting up, right? I tend to really lean heavily into one hip over the other.
Yeah.
And I think that stems from an injury I've had on this knee before. Is that something we should keep an eye out on? Because like, if we're super into one hip and then not as much into the other, could that potentially lead to some issues? Like, what are your thoughts there?
Yeah, for sure. So how much you kind of shift your pelvis over that stance leg is going to be a function of 2 things. It's going to be a function of your weight distribution on your feet, but also the amount of weight on the bar. So if you don't have a lot of weight, so if I'm unweighted right here and I lift a foot off the ground, my hip's going to have to shift over a little bit just to keep my overall center of mass over my foot. If I got a ton of weight on the bar, that's going to kind of make my body weight more or less negligible, and I'm going to be able to stay in a much more straight, kind of upright position with less shifting of the hips, just as a function of controlling my center of mass.
Got it.
But the other point to consider, just like a barbell squat or deadlift, is where that weight is on your feet. Common mistake on the single leg deadlift and why people struggle with balance a lot is that weight will roll to the outside edge of the foot. That's where you see a kind of excessive shift of the hips to the side as well. So people will be here, all that weight's on their pinky toe, and they just have no balance whatsoever. So you really want to make sure you keep some weight on that big toe as well.
Got it. And like, to add to that, and just a quick question there, I'm a big offender of that. I know I am.
Yeah.
So what I like to cue is like, let that arch almost compress a little bit.
Right.
Is that something that you ever use? So like sometimes, for example, I'll put like a towel under my arch and like focus on kind of pressing into that.
Yeah.
To focus on not leaning into that hip and kind of coming up, because I do that all of the time.
No, I love that cue. Being able to keep that big toe or first metatarsal head on the ground is really important for being able to get into that internally rotated position we want at the bottom of the lift, and a little bit of feedback. You know, if you got a band, a wedge, a towel, something like that you can place under your arch and or first metatarsal head, that can give you that feedback you need and really take what you feel in the glutes to the next level, just that subtle change.
Got it. And then on the top of your head, are there any other major mistakes that we want to keep an eye on when doing more single leg deadlift work, or do we kind of hit on everything? What do you think?
So we talked about hips kind of in this direction, kind of the opening and the closing, but a lot of times people will spin or helicopter as well. So we want to talk about helicoptering with the single leg deadlift. With the bar here, if you notice the bar is parallel with my hips or my torso here, as I lift the weight, I want to make sure I maintain that orientation on the way up and down. A lot of people, they'll spin out on the descent. They'll kind of externally rotate the hips, and they'll end up with a bar that's kind of angled on the floor like that. And then when they pick it up, it goes the other way, and it'll kind of helicopter like that. That's all going to make it a little bit more difficult to stabilize. So you really want to think about, keep those lats and core tight. All of those things you would on a regular deadlift too, to try to keep that bar square.
Got it. And so if we pick up that barbell and set it back down, it should relatively be in the same position. Like obviously there can be some discrepancy, but relatively speaking, like within some like healthy medium or range there.
It should look as if you're doing it on a Smith machine.
Perfect.
You know, whether you're on one or not, that bar path should be nice and vertical, shouldn't spin, shouldn't shift a whole lot.
I love that cue. All right, you have convinced me to do more single leg deadlift work. Let's quickly go over some whys as to why you'd want to implement this in your program if you're only bilateral pulling right now.
Yeah, for sure. So unilateral and bilateral training, I find both of them are important to incorporate in your program, but a lot of people don't understand the real reason why that is. So I think just because you're doing an exercise on one leg or with one arm doesn't automatically make it special, but oftentimes these exercises, these unilateral exercises, allow you to get your hips and your body into positions that you don't often see with a bilateral lift. In the case of the single leg deadlift, instead of having the legs kind of out from the body a little bit, we're able to get that pelvis shifting over the stance leg. We're able to get good internal rotation of the hip on the way down, and that allows us to fully lengthen the glute in a way that we just can't do with a bilateral exercise. So we really get to lengthen some tissue that we can't with a bilateral exercise and get the hips into some unique positions.
And then from a sport-specific, strength-specific benefit or why, is there anything there that you typically touch on with clients when you program these? Like if I was like an athlete coming to you and said, hey, why am I doing these? Like what would be a rationale there? Like I know we're lengthening that tissue and training tissues through different ranges of motion, but in the context of like daily life sports, strength sports, where does the why come in with the single leg deadlift?
Yeah, for sure. So I want to make sure people know it's not inherently better than bilateral training. So I don't want you to watch this video and think, you know, forget squats, forget deadlifts, just do single leg work. But it does complement your program.
Alec Blenis hates deadlifts. Emotional.
Exactly.
That's our clickbait title.
So do your single leg work, but do your bilateral work too. But that being said, in terms of like sport specificity, you know, functional training for life, single leg work is going to allow you to focus on things related to your gait and change of direction. So if you think, you know, you're playing a sport, you're going side to side, I pivot this way, right? I see that weight being shifted over that stance leg, and this is a position you don't really get with a bilateral lift, but in a single leg lift, see how that's almost the same position as I could get on a single leg deadlift. You're able to replicate some of those positions a little bit better. And then same thing, you know, with running, sprinting, that kind of thing, you have a lot of kind of legs right in line with the midline of the body, whereas generally when you get out into a bilateral stance, that's just a slightly different hip position. So it's important to kind of come at the hips, the glutes, target those tissues from a variety of angles.
Awesome. And then are there any other rationales or why to this movement that you'd want to touch on in this video?
You know, one thing that I love about single leg work in general is it kind of removes the back and to a lesser degree the grip as a limiting factor. So if I'm trying to train my glutes and hamstrings with a single leg deadlift, I can just light them up and my back is not going to get sore. My grip strength is probably not going to hold me back like it might in a bilateral lift. So whether I got, you know, straps, whatever, if my back is sore or if I'm just being a little bit more cautious with it, I can still get a phenomenal glute workout here.
Awesome, man. Well, thank you so much for bringing us through the single leg deadlift and explaining why you like to program them and some whys as to why everybody should probably have some variation in their program. We don't hate bilateral movement, it's entirely though. But Alec, thanks so much for coming on the channel. I'm gonna drop all his information down below. Definitely check him out because he is very big brained. I actually drove up to Minneapolis to visit him, to train with him and to learn from him. So as always, y'all, drop a like on the video, drop subscribe to the channel, and if you have any questions on the single leg deadlift, feel free to reach out to Alec or myself, whichever, it doesn't matter. But as always, y'all, we'll see you in the next one.
See ya.